A poor old man told a paralyzed female judge, "Free my son and I'll heal you." Everyone laughed at him. A paralyzed judge had built her career on cold logic and iron verdicts. But when a desperate old man knelt before her bench pleading, "Free my son and I'll heal you," the entire courtroom erupted in laughter. What they didn't know was that this poor black man carried a gift that would expose every lie, every injustice, and every broken soul in that room, starting with the judge herself. What happened next shook the foundations of everything Judge Nancy Larry believed about justice, mercy, and miracles. In the sterile halls of the criminal courthouse, where justice was supposed to be blind but often saw only what it wanted to see, Judge Nancy Larry wielded her gavel with absolute authority from her wheelchair. Paralyzed from the waist down for 15 years, she had built walls around her heart as thick as the oak panels lining her courtroom. But when Alfred Lewis, a poor 72-year-old janitor, stood before her bench begging for his son's freedom and offering the impossible in return, those walls began to crack. What seemed like the desperate ramblings of a broken father would become the catalyst for the most profound transformation, one that would force a judge to face her own verdict, guilty of losing her humanity long before she lost her ability to walk. Before we go into details, please subscribe, it's free, and it makes my day 100% better. Like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comment section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Judge Nancy Larry had presided over Courtroom 6 of the Metropolitan Criminal Court for 11 years, and in that time, she had never once been interrupted during sentencing. Not by a defendant, not by an attorney, and certainly not by a spectator. Her reputation as Ice Queen Nancy was well earned, cold, precise, unmerciful. From her elevated bench, seated in the custom-built wheelchair that had been her permanent companion for 15 years, she wielded her gavel with the absolute authority of someone who believed justice was a mathematical equation with no room for sentiment. The wheelchair was sterling, polished, and professional, designed to project power rather than disability. Nancy had spent years ensuring that no one saw her paralysis as weakness. She had transformed her tragedy into armor, her vulnerability into an impenetrable shell of competence and control. If anything, losing the use of her legs had made her more formidable. Where others might have seen limitation, Nancy Larry had found focus, a laser-sharp dedication to law, order, and the rigid structure that kept chaos at bay. On the morning of November 14th, Courtroom 6 was packed. The case of State versus Denison Lewis had drawn unusual attention, not because of its legal complexity, but because of its symbolism. Denison Lewis, a 28-year-old black man, stood accused of armed robbery and assault at a convenience store in the predominantly white suburban neighborhood of Riverside. The store owner, Marcus Pemberton, had positively identified Denison from a photo lineup. Security footage was grainy but showed a figure matching Denison's general build. The prosecution's case, led by the ambitious Martin Kozlov, was airtight according to conventional standards. Denison's public defender, an overworked and underpaid attorney named Sarah Chen, had done her best with limited resources. She'd pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline, questioned the reliability of the photo lineup procedures, and highlighted the fact that 3 witnesses placed Denison at his workplace across town during the robbery. But in Nance's courtroom, passionate defenses rarely overcome solid prosecutorial cases. Nancy believed in evidence, procedure, and the system. She had seen too many guilty defendants walk free on technicalities, too many defense attorneys playing to emotion rather than fact. Now, as she prepared to deliver her verdict, Nance's clear gray eyes swept across the courtroom with practiced authority. "Mr. Lewis," she began, her voice carrying that particular quality of controlled power that made even seasoned attorneys nervous, "the court has reviewed all evidence presented in this case. The prosecution has established beyond reasonable doubt that you were present at Riverside Minimart on the evening of August 3rd, that you threatened Mr. Pemberton with what appeared to be a firearm, and that you fled with approximately $340 in cash. While your defense has attempted to establish an alibi, the photographic evidence and eyewitness testimony are conclusive." In the defendant's seat, Denison Lewis sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table before him, his jaw tight. He was a lean man with intelligent eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools for a living. He wore the only suit he owned, bought secondhand for his mother's funeral 3 years ago. Beside him, Sarah Chen's face reflected helpless frustration. She knew what was coming and had no power to prevent it. Therefore, Nancy continued, this court finds you guilty of armed robbery and assault. Given the serious nature of these crimes and your refusal to show remorse or accept responsibility, I am sentencing you to 15 years in state prison, with a minimum of 10 years served before eligibility for parole.
No.
The single word cut through the formal proceedings like a gunshot. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the gallery. An elderly black man was rising from his seat in the back row, his weathered hands gripping the bench in front of him. He was thin, perhaps even frail, with white hair that formed a soft halo around his dark, deeply lined face. His clothes were worn but clean, work pants, a faded button-down shirt, heavy boots that had seen decades of labor. His eyes, bright with desperate intensity, fixed directly on Judge Nancy Larry. Your Honor, please. His voice cracked with emotion. Nance's expression hardened instantly. Sir, sit down immediately or you will be removed from this courtroom. My son didn't do this. The old man's voice gained strength, filling the space with a father's anguish. Please, Judge Nancy, I'm begging you. Bailiff. Nance's command was sharp. 2 court officers moved toward the elderly man. But before they could reach him, Alfred Lewis, for this was Dennison's father, stepped into the aisle, his hands raised not in surrender but in supplication. I have something to offer you, he said, his words tumbling out in desperate rush. Something you want more than anything in this world. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had frozen over her stenotype machine. Nance's eyes narrowed dangerously. Mr. Lewis, I presume? You have 5 seconds to sit down before I hold you in contempt and have you forcibly removed. I can make you walk again. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. For a moment, Nancy couldn't process what she'd heard. Then, as the meaning sank in, hot rage flooded through her. How dare he? How dare this man, this desperate father, weaponize her disability, use her most private pain as leverage in some pathetic bid to free his guilty son? Laughter broke out across the courtroom, nervous, shocked laughter from the gallery, a barely suppressed snort from Martin Kozlov at the prosecution table, even a few uncomfortable chuckles from the jury box, though the trial phase had concluded. Did he seriously just? Someone whispered loudly. Oh my God, the nerve. That's insane. Nance's hand came down with her gavel so hard the crack echoed like thunder. Silence. 10:23, 1:03 p.m. My priceless. Instant quiet fell. Nance's face was alabaster white, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Lewis, she said, her voice vibrating with controlled fury, you have just crossed a line that I did not think any person could be foolish enough to cross in my courtroom. Not only are you disrupting legal proceedings, you are now attempting to, what? Bribe me. Manipulate me. Using my disability as leverage. Alfred Lewis stood his ground, though his hands trembled. No,
No bribery. No manipulation.
Just the plain truth. My son is innocent, and I can prove it if you'll give me the chance. And in return, if you free him, if you look at the real evidence, I will heal you. I will make you walk again. I have the gift, Judge Nancy. I have the healing gift. The laughter that erupted this time was louder, more derisive. Someone in the back called out, "He's crazy." Another voice added, "Snake oil salesman." Even Sarah Chen looked mortified, her face buried in her hands. This was a disaster. Whatever slim hope Dennison might have had for appeal was evaporating in the circus his father had just created. But Nancy didn't laugh. She sat rigid in her wheelchair, her eyes locked on Alfred Lewis with an expression that mixed contempt, fury, and something else, something she immediately tried to suppress but couldn't quite manage. A flicker of old, dangerous hope. "Bailiff," she said quietly, "remove this man from my courtroom." As the officers moved toward him, Alfred Lewis called out, his voice rising above the noise, "Judge Nancy Larry. 15 years ago, September 22nd, 2010. A drunk driver hit your car on Highway 101 at 11:47 p.m. Your spine was crushed at the L1 vertebra. The doctors told you you'd never walk again. But they were wrong. They are still wrong. The paralysis isn't permanent, not if you're willing to believe. Nancy felt the blood drain from her face. How could he possibly know those details? The date, the time, the specific injury, all of it was in sealed medical records that had never been made public. The accident report had been buried under a confidential settlement agreement. She had made sure of that. The courtroom had gone quiet again, sensing that something significant had just shifted. How do you know that? Nance's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence it carried clearly. Alfred Lewis met her eyes with unwavering intensity. Because God shows me things, Judge Nancy. He shows me people's pain so I can help them heal it. Your body can be fixed, but first, your heart needs fixing. Free my innocent son. Look at the truth you've been too proud to see, and I'll show you a miracle. I promise you on my life, on my soul, on everything I hold sacred, I can make you walk again. This is absurd, Martin Kozlov interjected, rising from his seat. Your Honor, this circus has gone on long enough. This man is clearly mentally disturbed. I move that he be removed and charged with contempt, disruption of court proceedings, and attempted bribery of a sitting judge. Nance's mind was racing. The logical part of her, the part that had sustained her through law school, through the bar exam, through 15 years of physical therapy and pain and adaptation, knew that Kozlov was right. This was nonsense. Miraculous healing was fiction, the fantasy of desperate people who couldn't accept reality. She had consulted with 17 different specialists over the years. Her spinal cord injury was complete and permanent. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope of recovery. And yet, that flicker of hope, dormant for so many years, suddenly roared to life like a struck match in her chest. What if? What if there was even the smallest chance? No. She crushed the thought immediately. This was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that destroyed judicial integrity. This man was using her deepest vulnerability to free his guilty son. It was unconscionable. Mr. Lewis, Nancy said, her voice steady and cold once more. I am going to do something I have never done in 11 years on the bench. I am going to give you a choice. You can leave this courtroom right now, and I will not charge you with contempt. You can walk away and spare yourself legal consequences for this outburst. Or, if you say one more word, I will have you arrested immediately and you will spend the next 30 days in county jail. The choice is yours. Alfred Lewis looked at his son. Dennison was shaking his head frantically, silently pleading with his father to stop, to save himself. But Alfred's eyes were filled with tears and determination. I choose my son, he said simply. I choose truth. And I choose to offer you healing, whether you accept it or not. Judge Nancy, I'll be waiting when you're ready to listen. Bailiff, arrest this man. Charge him with contempt of court. As the officers moved in, taking Alfred by the arms, he didn't resist. He simply kept his eyes on Nancy, and in that gaze she saw something that disturbed her deeply. Not anger, not desperation, but compassion. He looked at her with pity, as though she were the one who needed help. I'll pray for you every day, Judge Nancy, Alfred said as they led him away. I'll pray that you find the courage to see what's right in front of you. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. Nancy sat frozen for a moment, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were white. The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone waiting to see what she would do next. She cleared her throat. This court will take a 30-minute recess. When we reconvene, I will complete the sentencing of the defendant. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and Nancy turned her wheelchair swiftly, propelling herself through the door to her chambers before anyone could see the expression on her face. Once inside her private office, she locked the door and wheeled to the window that overlooked the parking lot. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding. And for the first time in 15 years, she felt something in her legs, a warmth, a tingling sensation that was probably nothing more than psychosomatic response to emotional stress, but felt terrifyingly like possibility. Damn you, she whispered to the empty room. Damn you for making me hope again. Below in the parking lot, she watched as Alfred Lewis was led in handcuffs to a police cruiser. Just before they put him in the vehicle, he looked up at her window, somehow knowing exactly where she was, and nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a promise. Nancy turned away from the window and buried her face in her hands. She didn't know it yet, but her carefully constructed world had just begun to crumble. And unlike her legs 15 years ago, this collapse would ultimately save her rather than destroy her. But that realization was still many painful steps away. The 30-minute recess stretched to 45 minutes before Nancy could compose herself enough to return to the courtroom. When she did, her face was a perfect mask of judicial composure, but her hand still trembled slightly as she gripped her gavel. "This court is back in session," she announced. "Mr. Denison Lewis, please rise." Denison stood slowly, his public defender beside him. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had been crying during the recess, Nancy noted. Whether from the sentence he was about to receive or from seeing his father arrested, she couldn't tell. Perhaps both. 10/23, 1:04 p.m. My priceless. Mr. Lewis, as I was saying before we were interrupted, this court finds you guilty of armed robbery and assault and sentences you to. Nancy paused. Something was wrong. The words that had come so easily before the recess now felt heavy on her tongue, as though she were trying to speak through water. Sentences you to 15 years in state prison, with a minimum of. She stopped again. In her mind's eye, she kept seeing Alfred Lewis's face, that expression of absolute certainty when he claimed his son was innocent. But that was nonsense. The evidence was clear. The system had worked exactly as it should. Denison Lewis had been positively identified by the victim, and the security footage, while grainy, corroborated the identification. The timeline inconsistencies Sarah Chen had raised were minor, easily explained. The alibi witnesses from Denison's workplace were co-workers, friends, therefore biased. Nancy had reviewed hundreds of cases exactly like this one. The facts were straightforward. Why was she hesitating? Your Honor. Martin Kozlov prompted gently. The sentence. Nancy looked down at Denison Lewis. Really looked at him for the first time. He met her gaze without flinching, and in his eyes she saw something that made her chest tighten, not guilt or anger, but resignation. The look of a man who had already known, long before entering this courtroom, that the system was not designed to protect someone like him. 15 years, Nancy said finally, forcing the words out. With a minimum of 10 years served before eligibility for parole. The defendant is remanded to custody immediately. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. The sound echoed in Nancy's ears like a death knell. As the bailiffs led Denison Lewis away in handcuffs, he looked back once at the empty seat where his father had been sitting. Then he was gone, swallowed by the machinery of justice that would now define the next decade and a half of his life. Nancy wheeled herself back to her chambers as quickly as possible, ignoring the reporters who tried to shout questions at her about Alfred Lewis's bizarre outburst. Once inside, she locked the door and sat in silence for a long time. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Judge Larry, the media is requesting comment on the incident in court today. How should I respond? Nancy typed back, no comment. Any disruption has been dealt with appropriately according to law. But as she set her phone down, her eyes drifted to the shelf where she kept her personal effects, very few, as she believed in maintaining strict separation between her professional and private life. One photo frame sat there, dusty from neglect. It showed a younger Nancy, perhaps 32 years old, standing on a beach somewhere with wind in her hair and genuine joy on her face. She was laughing at something off camera, one foot kicked up playfully behind her. Standing. She hadn't looked at that photo in years. Now, she couldn't look away from it. That woman in the photograph felt like a stranger. Someone from another lifetime, another universe where bodies worked the way they were supposed to and hope wasn't a dangerous liability. Nancy picked up her phone again and pulled up the confidential court records for State versus Denison Lewis. She told herself she was just reviewing the case to prepare for the inevitable appeals and media scrutiny. But as she scrolled through the documents, she found herself reading with a different eye, not the eye of a judge confirming a verdict, but the eye of someone looking for flaws. The security footage was grainy, as noted. The figure in the video matched Denison Lewis's general build, 6 feet tall, approximately 175 pounds, wearing a dark hoodie. But the face was never visible. Not clearly. Not in any frame. The photo lineup that Marcus Pemberton had identified Denison from. Nancy pulled up the procedure report. Standard 6-photo array, conducted by Officer Raymond Hutchins 3 days after the robbery. Pemberton had identified Dennison's photo immediately, according to the report.
No hesitation, no uncertainty.
Too perfect? No, Nancy told herself firmly. She was grasping at straws, letting Alfred Lewis's emotional manipulation affect her judgment. Victim identifications were often confident because victims remembered their attackers clearly. It was simple, straightforward. But then why had Sarah Chen's timeline evidence bothered her? Nancy pulled up the time-stamped records from Dennison's workplace, a commercial HVAC company where he worked as a technician. According to the punch clock records, Dennison had clocked out at 5:47 p.m. on August 3rd. The robbery occurred at 7:15 p.m. The distance between Dennison's workplace in the city and the Riverside Minimart was approximately 45 minutes by car in light traffic, potentially an hour or more during rush hour. So theoretically, Dennison could have driven to Riverside, committed the robbery, and fled the scene before police arrived at 7:23 p.m. The timeline was tight but possible. Except, Nancy scrolled further. 3 co-workers had signed affidavits stating that they had gone with Dennison to a bar called Murphy's Tap House immediately after clocking out, arriving around 6 p.m., and remaining there until approximately 8:30 p.m. The bar's receipts and security cameras corroborated their presence. Martin Kozlov had dismissed this evidence by arguing that the bar's security footage was too poor quality to definitively identify Dennison, and that the co-workers were lying to protect their friend. The judge handling the preliminary hearing had agreed that the evidence created reasonable doubt but not sufficient to dismiss charges. Nancy leaned back in her wheelchair, her mind working through the pieces like a chess game. If Dennison Lewis had indeed been at Murphy's Tap House from 6 p.m. onward, he couldn't possibly have committed a robbery 45 minutes away at 7:15 p.m. Unless the co-workers were lying. Unless the bar receipts were falsified. Unless the timestamps were wrong. Unless... Stop, Nancy said aloud to herself. Just stop. She was second-guessing a verdict she had just handed down, undermining her own judgment based on nothing more than an old man's desperate fantasy and her own treacherous hope for a miracle that couldn't exist. Nancy closed the case files and turned to the window. Evening was falling outside, the November sky already dark. In the parking lot below, she could see the courthouse employees heading home, bundling against the cold, moving freely on 2 working legs without even thinking about the miracle of that simple act. Her legs. God, she could still feel that strange warmth from earlier, that tingling sensation that had no medical explanation. Phantom feelings, obviously. The mind playing cruel tricks. It happens sometimes to people with spinal injuries, ghost sensations, false hopes. But what if? No. Nancy forced herself to think about dinner, about her evening routine, about anything except Alfred Lewis and his impossible promise. Yet as she finally wheeled herself out of her chambers and toward the judge's parking area, she found her mind returning again and again to that moment when Alfred had looked at her with such compassion, such certainty. The way he had said, "God shows me things," not as religious platitude but as simple fact. Nancy had never been particularly religious. She had grown up in a nominally Christian household, Christmas, Easter, the occasional wedding or funeral at church, but faith had never taken root in her practical, evidence-based mind. After the accident, several meaning people had assured her that God had a plan and that everything happens for a reason, platitudes that had made her want to scream. What possible reason could there be for a drunk driver to destroy her life? What plan involved 15 years of pain, loss, and limitation? She had concluded that if God existed at all, he was either indifferent or cruel, and either way, not worthy of her trust. But Alfred Lewis hadn't spoken like someone offering empty comfort. He had spoken with the authority of personal experience, of having witnessed things that transcended ordinary understanding. Or he was delusional. That was far more likely. Nancy was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure standing beside her vehicle until she was almost upon him. She startled, her hand moving instinctively toward the panic button on her keychain. Judge Larry. A familiar voice. Martin Kozlov stepped into the light, his hands raised in a peaceable gesture. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. Nancy relaxed slightly, though she felt irritated at being approached in the parking lot. Mr. Kozlov. Something I can help you with. I just wanted to check on you after that scene in court today. Kozlov's handsome features were arranged in an expression of concern, but his eyes were calculating. Nancy had known him for 5 years. He was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of convictions. She respected his competence even if she didn't particularly like him personally. "I'm fine, thank you." The disruption was handled appropriately. That old man. Kozlov shook his head. "I've seen some desperate defense tactics in my career, but that was truly beyond the pale. Using your disability like that, trying to manipulate you emotionally. It was disgusting." Something in his tone bothered Nancy, though she couldn't immediately identify what. It was inappropriate, yes. But it's over now. Mr. Lewis Sr. has been charged with contempt, and his son has been sentenced according to law. Absolutely. Kozlov nodded vigorously. "Still, I wanted to make sure you're okay. I know you maintain professional distance. We all admire that about you, but that kind of personal attack can get under anyone's skin. I appreciate your concern, but I assure you, I'm perfectly fine." Of course. You're one of the strongest judges I've ever worked with, Nancy. May I call you Nancy outside the courtroom?" She didn't particularly want him to, but saw no polite way to refuse. "That's fine." "You know," Kozlov continued, his tone becoming more casual, "the Lewis case was always straightforward. Open and shut. The evidence was overwhelming. I'm sure you have no doubts about the verdict." It wasn't a question, but Nancy heard the implied pressure. The verdict was appropriate based on the evidence presented. Exactly. That's exactly right. Based on the evidence presented. Kozlov's smile was warm, but his eyes remained sharp. "I just want to make sure that today's circus doesn't lead to any second-guessing. You know how appeals work. Defense attorneys will try to use anything to claim judicial bias or improper influence. We need to make sure your verdict stands on its own merits, unaffected by that old man's insane ramblings." Now Nancy understood what was bothering her. Kozlov wasn't here out of concern for her well-being. He was here to ensure she didn't reconsider the case. "Mr. Kozlov," Nancy said coolly, "I have been a judge for 11 years. I do not base my decisions on insane ramblings, and I do not appreciate the implication that I might." No, of course not." Kozlov backpedaled smoothly. "That's not what I meant at all. I just wanted to offer my support if you need it. The media is probably going to try to make something out of today's incident, and I wanted you to know that my office will back you completely. We'll issue a statement affirming the strength of the case and the appropriateness of the verdict." "That won't be necessary. The verdict speaks for itself." "Wonderful. That's wonderful to hear." Kozlov stepped back, his smile never wavering. "Well, I'll let you get home. Just wanted to check in. Have a good evening, Judge." He walked away before Nancy could respond, leaving her with an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't quite name. She loaded herself into her specially modified vehicle, a process that had become mechanical over the years, the transfer from wheelchair to driver's seat so practiced it required no thought, and drove home on autopilot, her mind churning. Why had Kozlov really come to see her? Was he genuinely concerned about appeals, or was there something else? And why did his emphasis on based on the evidence presented feel like a warning rather than reassurance? By the time Nancy arrived at her house, a modest but comfortable ranch-style home she had bought specifically because it could be entirely wheelchair accessible, she had convinced herself she was being paranoid. Kozlov was right to be concerned about appeals. The Lewis case had gotten messy at the end, and messy cases invited scrutiny. That's all it was. Nothing more sinister than a prosecutor protecting his conviction rate. Nancy went through her evening routine mechanically. Transfer to her house wheelchair, prepare a simple dinner, eat while watching the news. The courthouse incident hadn't made the evening broadcast yet, thank God. It would probably appear tomorrow, a brief human interest oddity, desperate father makes bizarre promise to judge. After dinner, she attempted to read a legal journal but found herself unable to concentrate. Finally, she gave up and decided to turn in early. But sleep wouldn't come. Nancy lay in her specially designed bed, no cheap hospital frame for her. She had invested in the finest adjustable mattress money could buy, and stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet. In the darkness, She allowed herself to think the thought she had been suppressing all evening. What if Alfred Lewis was telling the truth? Not about healing, obviously. That was impossible. But what if he was telling the truth about his son's innocence? And if Denison Lewis was innocent, what did that make her? What did that make the verdict she had just handed down? The thought was terrifying because it wasn't academic. It was personal. Nancy had built her entire professional identity on being fair, thorough, and just. The idea that she might have just sentenced an innocent man to 15 years in prison. No, she couldn't think that way. The evidence had been clear. The process had been followed. The system had worked. But had it? Nancy's hand moved to her leg, pressing against the unfeeling flesh through her pajama pants. She had done this thousands of times over the years, hoping irrationally to feel something, anything. It never worked. This time, she felt warmth. Not imagination. Not psychosomatic. Actual, undeniable warmth, as though someone had placed a heating pad against her skin. Nancy gasped and sat up, her heart racing. She pulled back the covers and looked at her legs in the dim light from her bedside lamp. They looked the same as always, pale from lack of sun exposure, thinner than they used to be from muscle atrophy, completely ordinary. But the warmth remained. And as she sat there, breathless with something between fear and wonder, she felt it spread, slowly, gradually, from her thighs down toward her knees. This isn't happening, she whispered to the empty room. This is stress. This is psychological. This is... A memory surfaced, sudden and unbidden. Alfred Lewis's voice in the courtroom. I'll pray for you every day, Judge Nancy. I'll pray that you find the courage to see what's right in front of you. Was he praying now? From his cell in the county jail, was this old man actually praying for her healing? And could prayer possibly be powerful enough to... Stop, Nancy commanded herself firmly. Just stop this. You're being irrational. She forced herself to lie back down, pulling the covers up and closing her eyes with determination. She would sleep. She would wake up in the morning and the warmth would be gone, revealed as nothing more than a stress response or a muscle spasm or any of a dozen rational explanations. She would not allow herself to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the enemy of acceptance. Hope was what destroyed people, keeping them chasing miracles that would never come while their real lives passed them by. Nancy had learned that lesson 15 years ago, and she would not unlearn it now, not for anyone. But as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, her last conscious thought was of Alfred Lewis's eyes, not pleading or desperate, but filled with that unshakable certainty that had disturbed her so deeply. I can make you walk again. Nancy woke at 5:47 a.m., as she did every morning, her internal clock more reliable than any alarm. For a few blissful seconds, she existed in that liminal space between sleep and full consciousness, where nothing hurt and nothing was wrong. Then awareness returned, bringing with it the familiar catalogue of sensations, or rather, the lack thereof. Nothing below the waist. The same absence that had greeted her every morning for 15 years. Except... Nancy's eyes snapped open. The warmth was still there. Faint, but present. A subtle heat radiating through her legs that had no business existing. She threw back the covers and stared at her legs as if seeing them for the first time. They looked exactly the same. No visible change, no miraculous transformation. But the warmth persisted, undeniable. Nancy reached for her phone on the nightstand and pulled up her medical records. She kept them digitally accessible, though she rarely looked at them anymore. There it was. Complete spinal cord injury at L1 vertebra. Permanent paralysis from the waist down. Prognosis: no expected recovery. She had seen 17 specialists. She had tried every legitimate therapy and turned down dozens of illegitimate ones. She knew her condition with scientific certainty. And yet her legs were warm. Coincidence, Nancy muttered aloud, as if saying it firmly enough would make it true. Blood flow variation. Room temperature. Something. She completed her morning routine with practiced efficiency, transfer to the bathroom wheelchair, shower using the specially installed grab bars and shower seat, dress in one of her meticulously professional outfits. Every movement was automatic, refined through years of repetition into a mechanical dance that required no thought. But throughout it all, the warmth remained. And more than that, As Nancy brushed her teeth, staring at her reflection in the mirror, she could swear she felt a sensation. Not pain, not quite. More like awareness. As though her legs were waking up after a very long sleep. This is insane, she told her reflection. You're having a psychotic break. The stress of yesterday finally broke something in your brain. Her reflection stared back, unconvinced. By 7:15 a.m., Nancy was in her car, driving toward the courthouse through the pre-dawn darkness. November in the city meant sunrise came late and left early, painting everything in shades of gray and shadow. The roads were quiet, giving her too much time to think. She needed to focus on today's docket: 3 preliminary hearings, 2 sentencing reviews, and a motion to suppress evidence in a drug case. All standard, all routine. She would not think about Denison Lewis or his father or impossible warmth in dead legs. But when she arrived at the courthouse and made her way to her chambers, her assistant Maria was waiting with an expression that Nancy had learned to dread, the "we have a situation" face. "Morning, Judge," Maria said carefully. "I have some messages for you." "How many?" 17 from reporters, 6 from advocacy groups, 3 from the Judicial Review Board, and... Maria hesitated. 1 from a Dr. Patricia Keene at Metropolitan Medical Center. She says it's urgent and personal. Nance's stomach dropped. Dr. Keene had been one of her specialists years ago, a neurologist she had seen for second and third opinions before finally accepting that her condition was permanent. Why would Dr. Keene be calling now, after all this time? "Forward her call to me immediately when she calls back," Nancy said. "Hold the reporters indefinitely, tell the advocacy groups I'm reviewing their materials, and schedule a callback with the review board for this afternoon." What do they want? Maria's expression grew more uncomfortable. They want to discuss yesterday's courtroom incident and whether it represents grounds for recusal or bias concerns in future cases. Of course they did. Nancy felt a flash of anger, not at the review board for doing their job, but at Alfred Lewis for putting her in this position. One moment of disruption and now her judgment, her competence, her entire career was under scrutiny. Fine. Set it up. Anything else? The defendant from yesterday? Denison Lewis? His public defender filed an appeal notice first thing this morning. Grounds of insufficient evidence and, Maria checked her notes, claims of new evidence that was improperly excluded from the original trial. Nance's head snapped up. What new evidence? Nothing was excluded. Ms. Chen presented everything she had. I don't have details yet. The filing just says they're preparing a motion for a new trial based on evidence that wasn't available during the original proceedings. This was unusual. Appeals were routine, but claims of new evidence this quickly after sentencing almost never happened. Defense attorneys typically took weeks or months to prepare appeal documents. Get me a copy of that filing the moment it's available, Nancy ordered. And find out what this mysterious new evidence is supposed to be. Yes, Maria turned to leave, then paused. Judge, are you okay? You seem. I'm fine, Nancy said curtly. Just a headache. Thank you, Maria. Once alone in her chambers, Nancy wheeled to her desk and tried to settle into the familiar routine of reviewing case files. But her concentration was fractured, her mind spinning in too many directions at once. The warmth in her legs had intensified. She could feel it even through her slacks, a steady heat that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. More disturbingly, she was starting to feel what might have been tingling, the sensation of nerve endings waking up after long dormancy. Or she was having a complete psychological breakdown. That was entirely possible. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Keene, according to the caller ID. Nancy answered immediately. Dr. Keene, this is Nancy Larry. Judge Larry, thank you for taking my call. The doctor's voice was professional but carried an undertone of curiosity. I hope you'll forgive me reaching out after so long, but I heard something rather remarkable yesterday and I wanted to check in with you personally. Nance's mouth went dry. Oh. I have a colleague who was in your courtroom yesterday when that unfortunate incident occurred. The elderly gentleman who claimed he could heal you. She mentioned it to me, and I have to say, I'm concerned. I know from our previous work together that you're far too intelligent to be taken in by faith healers or miracle promises, but I wanted to make sure you're doing all right. These kinds of situations can be emotionally triggering for people with permanent injuries. The concern was genuine, Nancy could tell. Dr. Keene had always been kind as well as competent. But the doctor's assumptions, that of course Nancy would dismiss Alfred Lewis's claims, that of course she understood there was no possibility of healing, rankled in a way Nancy couldn't quite explain. I appreciate your concern, Dr. Keene, but I assure you I'm perfectly fine. The incident was disruptive but brief, and has been handled appropriately. I'm glad to hear that. Still, if you'd like to schedule a consultation, I'd be happy to see you. Sometimes trauma responses can be delayed, and given your history. That won't be necessary, Nancy interrupted, more sharply than she intended. Then, before she could stop herself, she added, Dr. Keene, hypothetically speaking, is there any circumstance under which a complete spinal cord injury could show signs of recovery years after the initial trauma? A long pause. Judge Larry, you know the answer to that. In 15 years, we've seen no development of nerve regeneration technology that could reverse the kind of injury you sustained. There are experimental therapies in trial phases, stem cell research showing promise, but nothing that would produce spontaneous healing without direct medical intervention. But theoretically, is it possible for the body to heal itself in ways we don't fully understand? Another pause, longer this time. When Dr. Keene spoke again, her voice was very gentle. Nancy, what's happening? Are you experiencing sensations? Nancy hesitated, then decided honesty was necessary. Warmth, tingling, very subtle, probably psychosomatic, but present. When did this start? Yesterday, after the incident in court. I see. Dr. Keene's tone had shifted from concern to professional assessment. Nancy, what you're describing is not uncommon in spinal cord injury patients, especially during periods of high stress. It's called neuropathic sensory phenomenon. Essentially, your brain creating phantom sensations in response to psychological triggers. It feels very real, but it doesn't indicate actual nerve recovery. I understand that, Nancy said stiffly. Do you? Because I'm hearing something in your voice that worries me. Hope is a beautiful thing in most contexts, but in cases of permanent paralysis, it can be genuinely dangerous. I've seen patients devastate themselves emotionally by chasing impossible cures, spending fortunes on quacks and charlatans, destroying their mental health in pursuit of miracles that cannot exist. I'm not chasing anything, Nancy said coldly. I simply asked a hypothetical question. Then let me give you a definitive answer. No. Complete spinal cord injuries do not spontaneously heal. Not now, not ever, not through prayer or faith or positive thinking or any other non-medical intervention. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but I would be doing you a disservice to suggest otherwise. Thank you, Dr. Keene. That's very clear. Nancy. I have to go. I have a full docket today, but I appreciate you reaching out. Nancy ended the call before the doctor could respond, then sat staring at her phone. Dr. Keene was right, of course. Medical science was clear. Permanent meant permanent. The warmth Nancy was feeling was psychological, a stress response, nothing more. And yet it persisted. And yet it felt so real. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Come in, Nancy called, grateful for the distraction. Maria entered, carrying a file. The appeal filing from the Lewis case. And Judge, there's something you should see. Nancy took the file and opened it, scanning the legal document quickly. Standard appeal language about insufficient evidence, improper jury instruction, prejudicial. She stopped cold. Attached to the appeal was an affidavit from a new witness. A woman named Deshawn Williams who claimed to have been present at the Riverside Minimart on the night of the robbery. According to her statement, she had seen the robber clearly, and it was not Dennison Lewis. The man who robbed Marcus Pemberton had been white, she claimed, with a distinctive scar on his left cheek and a teardrop tattoo near his eye. Why wasn't this witness called during the trial? Nancy demanded. Maria shook her head. According to the affidavit, she was afraid to come forward initially. She's a former addict with a record, thought the police wouldn't believe her. But after seeing news coverage of the trial and learning an innocent man had been convicted, Her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. Nancy read through the statement twice, her legal mind automatically analyzing its strengths and weaknesses. Deshaun Williams's credibility would be challenged immediately. Prior convictions, potential bias, convenient timing. A good prosecutor could tear this apart. But what if she was telling the truth? Nancy flipped to the next page and found security camera stills that she didn't remember seeing during the trial. These images were from a different angle than the ones admitted into evidence, exterior cameras rather than interior. The quality was terrible, dark, and grainy, but they showed a figure fleeing the scene. The figure was wearing the same dark hoodie as the man on the interior footage, but in these frames, as the person passed under streetlight, a few pixels of their face were visible. And those pixels looked decidedly lighter-skinned than Dennison Lewis. Where did these images come from? Nancy asked slowly. According to Ms. Chen's filing, they were part of the police evidence collection but were never turned over to the defense during discovery. She only learned about them after filing a Freedom of Information Act request for all evidence related to the case. Nancy felt something cold settle in her stomach. They weren't turned over to the defense. Apparently not. Ms. Chen is claiming prosecutorial misconduct, specifically Brady violation, evidence favorable to the defendant that was improperly withheld. A Brady violation, one of the most serious forms of prosecutorial misconduct, named after the Supreme Court case that established prosecutors' obligation to turn over all exculpatory evidence to the defense. If Martin Kozlov had deliberately withheld these images. Nancy's phone buzzed again. Martin Kozlov calling. Of course he was. She answered. Judge Larry. Nancy. I just heard about this ridiculous appeal filing. Have you seen it? I'm reviewing it now. It's desperate nonsense from a public defender who knows she botched the case. The new witness is a drug addict with 3 prior convictions, and those camera images are so dark and unclear they prove absolutely nothing. I wanted to give you a heads up that my office will be filing a motion to dismiss this appeal as frivolous and without merit. Mr. Kozlov, Nancy said carefully, did your office turn over all security camera footage to the defense during discovery? A pause, just a fraction too long. Of course. We always follow proper disclosure procedures. So the exterior camera images currently attached to the appeal filing, you provided those to Ms. Chen before trial. I'd have to check the discovery logs to be certain, but I'm confident we provided everything we were required to provide. Those particular images are so dark and unclear that they have no evidentiary value. They don't show anything definitive. Then why not include them and let the defense make that determination? Nancy. Kozlov's voice took on a note of concern that felt patronizing. You're sounding like you're actually considering this appeal seriously. You can't let that old man get into your head. This is exactly what I was worried about yesterday. The Lewis family is manipulating you emotionally, and now they're throwing out wild accusations of misconduct to create reasonable doubt where none exists. I'm not letting anyone get into my head, Mr. Kozlov. I'm simply reviewing an appeal filing as I would any other. Of course, of course. I just want to make sure you're seeing this clearly. The Lewis case was solid. Your verdict was correct. Don't let desperation tactics undermine your confidence in the system. There it was again, that subtle pressure, that implication that questioning the verdict was tantamount to questioning her own competence. I'll review the filing objectively, as always, Nancy said. Thank you for the call. She hung up before he could continue, then sat back in her wheelchair, her mind working through the implications of what she'd just read. If Deshaun Williams was telling the truth, if those exterior camera images did show a white suspect, if evidence had been improperly withheld from the defense, then Dennison Lewis might actually be innocent. And if he was innocent, then she had just sentenced him to 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The thought was sickening. But the alternative, that this was all fabrication, that Sarah Chen had manufactured a witness and was now accusing a respected prosecutor of misconduct, seemed almost as disturbing. Nancy wanted to believe in the system she had served for over a decade. She wanted to believe that justice, while imperfect, generally worked. But she kept coming back to Dennison Lewis's eyes in that courtroom. The resignation she had seen there. The look of a man who had known, long before the verdict, that he would be found guilty regardless of the truth. A buzzing sensation shot through Nancy's left leg, strong enough to make her gasp. Not warmth this time, but something more, actual feeling, as though someone had touched her shin. Nancy grabbed her leg with both hands, squeezing hard. Could she feel that? Was that her hand she was sensing, or just phantom nerves firing randomly? She couldn't tell, but the sensation was undeniable. "This is impossible," she whispered. Her intercom buzzed. Maria's voice. "Judge Larry, your first hearing starts in 15 minutes. The Peterson case." Nancy forced herself to focus. She had a job to do. Whatever was happening with her legs, whatever questions the Lewis case was raising, she had other defendants waiting for her attention, other cases that deserved her full concentration. "I'll be ready," Nancy replied. "And Maria, I want you to personally pull all the original discovery materials from the Lewis case, everything that was turned over to the defense before trial. I want to verify exactly what evidence Ms. Chen received and when. Should I notify Mr. Kozlov's office?" "No. This is just for my own review. If the appeal moves forward, we'll need to understand the full record anyway." Nancy wheeled herself to the small private bathroom attached to her chambers. She needed to splash cold water on her face, clear her head, push aside all the distractions and emotions that were clouding her judgment. As she transferred from her wheelchair to the accessible sink, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked haggard, dark circles under her eyes from poor sleep, tension lines around her mouth. "Get it together," she told her reflection firmly. "You are Judge Nancy Larry. You are objective, rational, and fair. You do not make decisions based on emotion or manipulation or—" The sentence died as another sensation shot through her legs, this time strong enough that her knees that hadn't moved in 15 years, twitched visibly. Nancy stared down at her legs, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "No," she said aloud. "No, this isn't real. This is stress. This is psychosomatic. This is—" Her right foot moved. Just slightly, barely a centimeter, but it moved. Of its own accord, responding to a signal from her brain that shouldn't have been able to reach it. Nancy gripped the sink so hard her knuckles went white. She was shaking all over, whether from fear or excitement or disbelief she couldn't say. In the county jail, just 3 miles away, Alfred Lewis sat in his cell, hands folded in prayer, speaking quietly to a God he had never doubted. He had been praying since midnight, and he would continue until the miracle was complete. Because Alfred knew something that Judge Nancy Larry was only beginning to understand. Some healings can't begin until the hardest part of a person's heart starts to crack open. And Nancy's heart, encased in 15 years of protective ice, was finally beginning to thaw. Nancy somehow made it through the Peterson hearing, though afterwards she couldn't have recounted a single argument either attorney had made. She ruled by instinct and procedure, going through the mechanical motions of justice while her mind spun in circles. Her legs were moving. Slightly, unpredictably, but moving. Throughout the hearing, she had felt sensations, pressure, temperature, position awareness, that had been absent for 15 years. Once, when the defense attorney raised an objection, Nancy had shifted her weight in her wheelchair and felt her right thigh muscle contract in response. It was impossible. It was happening anyway. By the lunch recess, Nancy knew she needed help. Not from Dr. Keene, who would simply reiterate that this was psychosomatic. She needed someone who could be objective about what she was experiencing without immediately dismissing it as delusion. She called her sister. Rebecca Santos, formerly Rebecca Larry, was 5 years older than Nancy and in most ways her polar opposite. Warm when Nancy was cold, spontaneous when Nancy was controlled, deeply religious when Nancy was skeptical. They had never been particularly close, especially after the accident when Rebecca's well-meaning faith-based platitudes had driven Nancy away. But Rebecca was also a physical therapist who specialized in neurological rehabilitation. If anyone could assess what was happening objectively, it was her. "Nancy." Rebecca's voice held surprise when she answered. The sister spoke perhaps 3 times a year, always brief, always formal. "Is everything okay?" "I need you to come to my house tonight," Nancy said without preamble. "I need you to examine me. Professionally." A pause. "Examine you. Nancy, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "I don't know." Maybe. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. Can you come? Of course. What time? 7 o'clock. And Rebecca, don't mention this to anyone. Not your husband, not your kids, no one. This is confidential. Okay. Rebecca's voice was cautious now, concerned. Nancy, you're scaring me a little. Can you give me some idea what this is about? Nancy closed her eyes. I think I might be getting feeling back in my legs. Or I'm having a psychotic break. I honestly can't tell which. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, very quietly, oh my God. I'll be there at 7. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Nancy forced herself through 2 more hearings and a sentencing review, but her concentration was fractured. At one point, she had to ask an attorney to repeat his argument 3 times before her brain processed the words. Between cases, she retreated to her chambers and locked the door, then carefully experimented with her legs. Could she move them voluntarily? The answer seemed to be maybe, sometimes, partially. When she concentrated very hard, she could sometimes make her toes curl slightly or her knee bend a fraction. The movements were weak and inconsistent, like trying to control a limb through thick gloves, but they were movements. Real, undeniable movements. Nancy knew she should call Dr. Keene back, schedule an emergency MRI, pursue every medical avenue to understand what was happening. But she found herself hesitating. Part of her, the irrational, desperate part she had spent 15 years trying to suppress, didn't want a doctor to explain this away. She wanted, needed, to believe that maybe, possibly, impossibly, Alfred Lewis had been telling the truth. At 4:30, Maria knocked on her door with news that made Nance's stomach drop. Judge, I pulled the discovery records from the Lewis case like you asked. You should see this. Maria handed her a file. Inside were the original discovery logs, formal records of what evidence had been turned over from the prosecution to the defense and when. Nancy scanned the list quickly, looking for any mention of exterior security camera footage. Nothing. The interior convenience store footage was listed, but no exterior angles. No camera images from outside the building at all. There's more, Maria said quietly. I made some calls to friends in the prosecutor's office, discreetly, like you asked. Apparently, there's been talk for a while about Kozlov's discovery practices. Nothing official, nothing proven, but whispers that he sometimes holds back evidence that might weaken his cases, then claims it wasn't exculpatory or wasn't requested properly. Nancy looked up sharply. Why hasn't anyone reported this? Maria shrugged uncomfortably. He's powerful. His conviction rate is the highest in the office. He wins cases that other prosecutors can't. And the evidence is always circumstantial. He never gets caught red-handed, so to speak. It's just a pattern that people notice but can't quite prove. Nance's hands tightened on the file. Has he ever been formally investigated? Not that I know of. Like I said, it's all whispers and speculation. But Judge, if those exterior camera images existed before trial and weren't turned over. Maria didn't need to finish the sentence. If Kozlov had deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence, Denison Lewis had been convicted through prosecutorial misconduct. And Nancy, by accepting the case at face value without questioning the discovery process, had been complicit in that misconduct. Thank you, Maria. Not a word of this to anyone. Of course. After Maria left, Nancy sat alone in her chambers, staring at the discovery log. Her entire career had been built on faith in the system, the belief that while individual cases might be messy, the overall machinery of justice was sound. Prosecutors played by the rules. Defense attorneys did their best with limited resources. Judges evaluated evidence objectively. The system worked. But what if it didn't? What if the system was so deeply flawed that innocent people were routinely convicted while judges like her, confident in their objectivity, never questioned whether the evidence they were seeing was complete? Nancy thought about all the cases she had presided over in 11 years. How many of those defendants had been sent away on incomplete evidence? How many Martin Kozlovs were out there, gaming the system by withholding just enough to secure convictions? Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Judge Larry, this is Sarah Chen. I know it's inappropriate to contact you directly, but I'm begging you to look closely at the Lewis appeal. I've been a public defender for 7 years, and I've never seen misconduct this blatant. Denison Lewis is innocent. Please, give him a chance. Nancy stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Direct contact from an attorney with a pending case was absolutely inappropriate. She should report Chen to the Bar Association for ethical violations. But she didn't. Because deep down, beneath all her professional training and careful objectivity, she was starting to believe that Sarah Chen was right. At 6:45, Nancy left the courthouse and drove home, her mind churning. The sensations in her legs had grown stronger throughout the day. She could now feel the pressure of her feet against the wheelchair footrests, could sense the texture of her slacks against her thighs. It was as though her body was waking up incrementally, coming back to life one nerve ending at a time. Rebecca was already waiting when Nancy arrived home, sitting in her car in the driveway. She got out as Nancy's vehicle pulled in, and Nancy saw her sister's face was tight with worry and poorly concealed hope. "Hey," Rebecca said softly, opening Nancy's driver's side door. "I've been sitting here trying not to imagine what you meant about feeling in your legs, because I don't want to get my hopes up or freak out or—" She stopped herself. "Sorry. Professional. I need to be professional. Tell me what you're experiencing." Inside the house, Nancy transferred to her home wheelchair and led Rebecca to the living room. She described everything that had happened since yesterday, the courtroom incident with Alfred Lewis, the warmth that had started that evening, the growing sensations and the slight movements she was now able to produce. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her physical therapist face firmly in place. But Nancy could see the emotions flickering in her sister's eyes: hope, fear, disbelief, wonder. "Okay," Rebecca said when Nancy finished. "I need to examine you thoroughly. Can we go to your bedroom where you have space to lie down?" For the next 45 minutes, Rebecca put Nancy through a comprehensive neurological assessment. She tested reflexes that Nancy hadn't had in 15 years. She mapped sensation across Nancy's legs with pinpricks and temperature changes. She measured muscle response and nerve conductivity as best she could without hospital equipment. And her expression grew more and more astonished. "Nancy," Rebecca said finally, sitting back on her heels, "this is impossible. You have measurable sensation in areas that have been completely denervated for 15 years. You have voluntary muscle control, even if it's weak. You have reflexes that shouldn't exist." She shook her head slowly. "I don't understand how this is possible. The kind of healing you're showing would require nerve regeneration on a scale that medical science says can't happen spontaneously." "But it is happening. It is happening. I can't deny what I'm measuring. But Nancy, I need you to understand, this shouldn't be possible. Not without some kind of intervention. Surgery, stem cell therapy, some massive medical treatment. And even then, recovery like this would take months or years, not 2 days." Nancy met her sister's eyes. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Do you believe in miraculous healing?" Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Then, "I believe God can do anything. I've always believed that. But I also believe He usually works through medicine, through doctors, through science. Direct miraculous intervention is rare." "That's not what I asked. Do you believe it's possible for God to heal someone instantly, without medical intervention?" "Yes," Rebecca said quietly. "I believe it's possible. Do I believe it's common? No. Have I ever personally witnessed it? No. But is it possible? Yes. Then what if that's what's happening to me?" Rebecca looked troubled. "Nancy, what did that old man do to you in the courtroom?" "Nothing. He just said he could heal me if I freed his son." "And did he touch you? Did he pray over you?" "No. He was arrested before he could get close to me." "Then how?" Rebecca stopped, realization dawning on her face. "He said he would pray for you. Didn't he?" "He said he would pray." Nancy nodded slowly. Rebecca stood and began pacing, her therapist's composure cracking. "Nancy, if this is what I think it is, if this man has some kind of actual healing gift and it's working from a distance, this is incredible. This is world-changing. This is—" She stopped and looked at Nancy intently. What are you going to do? I don't know. His son. The one in prison. You convicted him. Yes. And the father offered to heal you in exchange for freeing him. Yes. Rebecca's eyes widened. Oh, Nancy. Oh, no. Do you think the son is innocent? Nancy didn't answer immediately. She thought about the warmth in her legs, the impossible healing that was undeniably occurring. She thought about the hidden camera footage and the mysterious witness and Martin Kozlov's too smooth assurances. She thought about Dennison Lewis's resigned eyes and Alfred Lewis's absolute certainty. I don't know, Nancy said finally, but I'm starting to think I need to find out. Rebecca sat down beside her sister, taking her hand. If he is innocent, and you free him, people will say you were coerced. They'll say you were manipulated by the promise of healing. Your career will be destroyed. I know. But if he's innocent and you don't free him, you'll have to live with that. You'll have your healing, but you'll know you left an innocent man in prison to get it. I know that too. The sisters sat in silence for a moment. Then Rebecca squeezed Nancy's hand gently. For what it's worth, I think the Nancy I remember from before the accident, the one who went into law because she actually believed in justice, I think she would know what to do. That Nancy died 15 years ago. Did she? Or did she just forget how to walk in more ways than one? Nancy pulled her hand away, irritated. Please don't turn this into some kind of spiritual metaphor. I'm not. I'm just saying that sometimes we become paralyzed in our hearts long before our bodies show it. And sometimes healing the body requires healing the heart first. Rebecca stood. I'm going to write up my findings and send them to you. You should schedule a full medical workup as soon as possible. MRI, nerve conduction studies, the works. Whatever is happening, it needs to be properly documented. I will. Rebecca moved toward the door, then paused. Nancy, one more thing. If this is a genuine miracle, and I think it might be, then it's not really about you. Miracles are never just for the person being healed. They're signs, demonstrations, calls to something bigger. If you're being healed, it's not just so you can walk again. It's so you can walk toward something. Or someone. After Rebecca left, Nancy sat alone in her living room as darkness fell outside. She thought about what her sister had said, about miracles being signs, about healing being purposeful. If Alfred Lewis's prayers were truly healing her, what was she supposed to do with that miracle? Accept it gratefully and move on with her life? Or accept the responsibility that came with it, the call to use her position and power to seek truth, even if that truth cost her everything she had built? Nancy transferred from her wheelchair to the couch, then attempted something she hadn't tried in 15 years. Slowly, concentrating with every ounce of willpower she possessed, she pressed down with her right leg. Her knee straightened slightly. Her foot pressed against the floor. The movement was weak, shaky, but undeniable. Nancy began to cry, quiet tears that she couldn't seem to stop. They weren't tears of pure joy. They were too complicated for that. Relief, yes. Wonder, absolutely. But also fear and guilt, and the terrible weight of understanding that this gift came with a price. That price was truth. And truth, Nancy was learning, was far more difficult than justice. She wiped her eyes and reached for her phone. It took her 20 minutes to compose the email, deleting and rewriting it a dozen times. Finally, she sent it. To the Judicial Review Board, I am formally requesting a full review of State versus Dennison Lewis, including investigation into potential prosecutorial misconduct in evidence disclosure. I believe there is substantial reason to question the validity of the conviction and request an emergency hearing on the defendant's pending appeal. Signed, Judge Nancy Larry. The moment she hit send, Nancy knew her career as she had known it was over. The Ice Queen was melting, and whatever emerged from that thaw would be someone she didn't yet know. But for the first time in 15 years, that unknown future didn't terrify her. It felt like waking up. The next morning, Nancy's inbox exploded. The email to the review board had triggered an immediate chain reaction. By 8 a.m., she had received urgent messages from the chief judge, from Martin Kozlov, from the district attorney's office, and from 3 different media outlets who had somehow already gotten wind of the story. Nancy ignored them all and drove to the county jail. She had called ahead, using her judicial authority to arrange a meeting with Alfred Lewis. The desk sergeant had been surprised. Judges didn't typically visit inmates in detention facilities, but hadn't questioned her right to do so. Now, sitting in a small private consultation room normally reserved for attorney-client meetings, Nancy waited. Her legs were trembling, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of muscle activity. She could feel her toes pressing against the inside of her shoes. She could sense her calves tensing and relaxing. The healing was accelerating. The door opened and a corrections officer led Alfred Lewis inside. The old man looked smaller here, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the institutional setting. But his eyes, those bright, penetrating eyes, held the same certainty they had in the courtroom. When he saw Nancy, his face broke into a gentle smile. "Judge Nancy, you came." "Sit down, Mr. Lewis." Alfred sat, his weathered hands folding naturally into a posture of prayer. "You're feeling it, aren't you? The healing." Nancy's throat was tight. "How is this possible? You haven't touched me. You haven't even been near me. How can prayer from 3 miles away do this?" "God isn't limited by distance, Judge Nancy. His power doesn't." "God isn't limited by distance, Judge Nancy. His power doesn't need my hands, only my faith and your willingness to receive." Alfred's eyes were warm with compassion. "But that's not why you came here, is it? You came to ask me about my son." Nancy nodded slowly. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Lewis. Is Dennison innocent?" "As innocent as a newborn child," Alfred said without hesitation. "My boy was at Murphy's Tap House that night, just like his friends testified. He never went near that store, never robbed anyone, never hurt anyone." His voice cracked. "But I knew the moment they arrested him that the truth wouldn't matter. A poor black man accused by a white store owner? The system was going to convict him no matter what we said." "Then why didn't you speak up sooner? Why wait until sentencing to make your offer?" Alfred's expression grew sorrowful. "Because I was waiting for God to show me the right moment. The moment when your heart would be ready to hear. If I tried earlier, you would have dismissed me as just another desperate father making excuses. But God showed me your pain, Judge Nancy. Showed me that you were paralyzed in your soul long before your body stopped working. He told me that healing you and freeing my son were the same miracle, both about restoring what had been broken." Nancy felt tears prickling her eyes. "The review board is investigating the case. There's evidence that was withheld from the defense, camera footage that shows a white suspect, a witness who can identify the real robber. But Mr. Lewis, you need to understand what this means for me. If I overturn this conviction, people will say I was coerced. They'll say I traded justice for healing. My career will be destroyed." "I know," Alfred said gently, "and I'm sorry for that. But Judge Nancy, answer me this. Would you rather walk on your legs but carry an innocent man's imprisonment on your conscience? Or would you rather do what's right, regardless of what it costs you?" The question hung in the air between them. Nancy thought about the 15 years she had spent building walls around her heart, convincing herself that cold objectivity was the same as justice. She thought about all the defendants she had sentenced without ever wondering if the system that brought them before her was truly fair. She thought about the woman she had been before the accident, idealistic, passionate about justice, believing she could make a difference. "My sister said something last night," Nancy said quietly. "She said miracles aren't just about the person being healed. They're about what that healing calls us toward."
Alfred smiled.
"Your sister is a wise woman. I'm going to free your son, Mr. Lewis. Not because of the healing, though God knows I'm grateful for it, but because it's the right thing to do. Because the evidence shows he's innocent, and I will not allow an innocent man to remain in prison, regardless of what it costs me personally." Tears rolled down Alfred's weathered cheeks. "Thank you, Judge Nancy. Thank you." "But I need you to understand something," Nancy continued firmly. "When I overturn this conviction, the healing has to stop." Alfred looked startled. "What?" "If I'm going to do this, it has to be absolutely clear that I'm acting on evidence, not on being influenced by miraculous healing." I can't walk out of that courtroom after freeing your son, or everyone will think I was manipulated. So the healing needs to stop now, at whatever level it's reached. Can you do that? Can you stop praying for me?" Alfred was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, Judge Nancy. I can't do that." Nancy felt panic rising. "Mr. Lewis, you don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Alfred interrupted gently. "The healing isn't mine to control. It's God's work, not mine. I can't turn it on or off like a faucet. All I can do is pray, and God does what God does. If He wants to heal you completely, He will. If He wants to heal you partially, He will. And if He wants to heal you publicly so that everyone sees His power, then that's what will happen. But my career will be whatever it's meant to be," Alfred said firmly. "Judge Nancy, you've spent 15 years trying to control everything. Your emotions, your pain, your life. But some things can't be controlled. Some things just have to be surrendered to. This miracle isn't yours to manage. It's God's to give. Your only job is to do what's right and trust that the rest will work out how it's supposed to." Nancy sat back in her wheelchair, frustration and fear warring in her chest. Everything in her legal training, her judicial experience, her careful approach to life screamed that this was dangerous, reckless, impossible to justify. But another voice, quieter, deeper, the voice of the woman she used to be, whispered that maybe faith meant doing the right thing even when you couldn't control the outcome. "I'm terrified," Nancy admitted. "I know," Alfred said kindly. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. You're already brave, Judge Nancy. You just forgot for a while." Nancy stood to leave, then paused. "Mr. Lewis, when Dennison gets out, and he will get out, what will you both do?" Alfred's face lit up with joy. "We'll go home. Have dinner together. Thank God for His mercy. And then we'll figure out how to rebuild what was almost stolen from us." He met her eyes. "Same as you, I imagine." The emergency hearing was set for 3 days later. In that time, Nancy's healing accelerated dramatically. By the morning of the hearing, she could stand with assistance. She could take stumbling, weak steps if someone supported her. The transformation was medically impossible, spiritually undeniable. The courtroom was packed with media, advocates, and curious observers. Martin Kozlov sat at the prosecution table, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. Sarah Chen sat beside Dennison Lewis, hope and fear mixed on both their faces. And in the gallery, Alfred Lewis sat in his same seat, hands folded in prayer. Nancy wheeled herself to the bench, very aware that this might be the last time she presided over a courtroom. The review board's investigation had uncovered everything: the withheld camera footage, Deshaun Williams's testimony, a pattern of discovery violations in Kozlov's cases spanning years. The evidence of Dennison's innocence was overwhelming. But the media narrative had already formed. Judge claims miraculous healing while overturning conviction. Faith healer's prayer influences court decision. Judicial ethics in question after bizarre case. Nancy took a deep breath and began. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented in the appeal of State versus Dennison Lewis. After thorough investigation, I find that the defendant was convicted based on incomplete evidence due to prosecutorial misconduct in violation of Brady versus Maryland." She detailed every failure, every withheld piece of evidence, every ethical violation. She explained how Deshaun Williams's testimony and the exterior camera footage created more than reasonable doubt. They established actual innocence. Therefore, Nancy concluded, her voice strong and clear, this court hereby vacates the conviction of Dennison Lewis and orders his immediate release. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. The defendant is free to go. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward. Dennison Lewis collapsed into Sarah Chen's arms, sobbing. And Alfred Lewis stood, his face radiant with gratitude, his hands raised toward heaven. Nancy banged her gavel for order, then did something she had never done in 11 years on the bench. She stood up, not wheeling away to her chambers, not transferring to another chair, but standing on her own 2 legs. Shaky, uncertain, but standing. The courtroom fell silent. I want everyone here to understand something, Nancy said, her voice carrying clearly even as her legs trembled beneath her. I did not free Denison Lewis because of any healing or miracle. I freed him because the evidence proves his innocence, and because justice demands that we correct our mistakes, no matter how painful that correction might be. She looked directly at Alfred Lewis. But I also want to acknowledge that sometimes God uses our brokenness, both physical and spiritual, to teach us what truly matters. I was paralyzed in my heart long before I was paralyzed in my body. And if it took a miracle to teach me to see clearly again, then I'm grateful for that lesson, regardless of what it costs me professionally. Nancy turned to Martin Kozlov. The district attorney's office will be conducting a full review of your cases. I recommend you retain counsel. Then she looked at Denison Lewis, who was staring at her with awe and gratitude. Mr. Lewis, I cannot give you back the time that was stolen from you. But I can tell you this, you leaving this courtroom a free man is not a miracle. It's just justice, finally, belatedly, arriving where it should have been all along. I'm sorry it took so long. Nancy sat back down, not in her wheelchair, but in her judge's chair, her legs supporting her weight. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. Nancy resigned from the bench 2 weeks later, before the Judicial Review Board could complete their investigation into whether her relationship with Alfred Lewis constituted a conflict of interest. She didn't fight it, didn't protest. She simply walked away, literally walked away, on legs that grew stronger every day. The media circus lasted another few weeks before moving on to other stories. Martin Kozlov was disbarred after investigation revealed over 30 cases with discovery violations. 17 wrongful convictions were overturned. Nancy took a position at a non-profit legal organization dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. The pay was a fraction of her judicial salary. The prestige was non-existent. The work was harder than anything she had ever done. She had never been happier. 6 months after that hearing, Nancy attended Denison Lewis's wedding. He had reunited with his high school sweetheart, who had waited for him through everything. Alfred Lewis officiated the ceremony. It turned out he was an ordained minister who had spent 40 years pastoring a small church in the poorest part of the city. At the reception, Alfred found Nancy standing by herself, watching the celebration. "You're walking without any assistance now," he observed with satisfaction. "Completely healed," Nancy confirmed. "My doctors call it impossible. I call it grace." "And are you happy, Judge Nancy? Even though you lost everything?" Nancy smiled, a genuine, warm smile that her sister Rebecca said made her look like herself again. "I didn't lose everything, Mr. Lewis. I lost a career built on cold objectivity and false certainty. But I found something better, the ability to see clearly, to act justly, and to walk, in every sense of the word, toward truth instead of away from it." Alfred squeezed her shoulder gently. "Then the miracle is complete." As Nancy watched Denison dance with his new wife, watched Alfred beam with grandfatherly pride, watched a family that had been torn apart slowly knit itself back together, she understood finally what her sister had meant. Miracles weren't just about the person being healed. They were about what that healing made possible for everyone else. She had been given the gift of walking again. But the greater gift was learning where to walk, and why. Justice, mercy, and humility. Not opposing values, but interwoven threads of the same truth. Nancy took a deep breath and stepped onto the dance floor, joining the celebration on legs that had learned, finally, how to carry her toward what truly mattered. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to click the subscription box, comments, and like.